Kathryn Ricketts. I teach at the University of Regina, and I'm working with the object, the story, and the body. And I'm working with marginalized groups like elders, youth at risk, newcomers, and mixed abilities. And what I do with that is I try to surface stories. And when I say surface, I mean I don't try to force stories on people. What I try to do is create a certain kind of environment where the stories surface, just like bugs that have never seen the light of day. So this is my lug character, and I will tell you more about how I work with that. But first, I introduce you to Jorge Holguin, who is a good friend of mine who died in 1989. I went to Copenhagen to work with him, and while he was quite ill and sitting in the dance studio with a blanket around him and the dancers in front of him, I stood between. He gave me images, metaphors, concepts. I moved them, and the dancers then moved what I moved. So they reinterpreted my movement. And so I think of myself as a kinesthetic conduit, where people tell me their stories, and I move them through my lived experiences, and I put them out for you to reinterpret. Another principle that's really important for me is working off axis. So when we are working vertically and straight up and down, we are almost controlling our information, holding on to our stories. And what I like to do is move off axis, so I go out of balance and I have to work against my habitual ways of working in the world. New information comes. So I'm going to tell you about a counselor who I worked with, and we were trying to generate scripts together based on childhood stories. Hockey, when we were children, and we were telling these stories, moving our hockey sticks with complete control. And I said, what would happen if we put them on our shoulders, that we didn't use them with our hands? And suddenly our habits were broken, and new information came. This is embodied poetic narrative. It's a realm of imagination with three portals: the story, the body, and the object. And you can enter from any of those portals. Start with movement, then tell a story, then manipulate an object that's emblematic of the story. So as Heidegger says, we think in language, language thinks us. Or as Turkle says, we think with objects we love the objects we think with. And Snober and Barthes says, flesh of the body, flesh of the word, flesh of the world. This is the lug character. And so what happens with this character is that I move with a suitcase, and I usually have objects inside the suitcase. And the objects are emblematic of a story. And when I tell a story, I reinterpret it so that it will trigger a story in you. Sometimes those objects are artifacts like onions. Onions can work on a physical level, metaphoric, layers and layers, or on a biochemical level that they make us cry. And so I very carefully choose our artifacts so that they will trigger different stories in all of you. These stories might have a trigger like the first time the last time We'll write a story timed in 2 or 3 minutes. I'll throw a ball at you. You catch the ball and you tell me some of the words from those stories quickly. We work on quick impulse, instinct. We transport those words to another piece of paper, and we create what I call a fractured narrative. We don't count out the syllables. We don't try to make it rhyme. We just try to poeticize the writing. And in that way, we make a kind of sponge where it opens up and loses the specificity of your story and becomes a poem that could be reinterpreted by somebody else. This is another way that I do it with Twitter feed. So with the brevity of tweets, we already create some kinds of poems. I put them through something called visible tweets, where they fracture on a screen and they become poetry. And so that's how I work with digital literacies in my classrooms. This is another way where I will take a fractured image, a fractured sentence, and I will move in front of that, thereby creating 3 different ways that you can make your own interpretations: visually, kinesthetically, or textually. And so this is really important when I'm working with people with second, third languages, where we can't be so focused on just understanding through the words, but through other modalities as well. So with this work, I don't just work by myself. I also work with community members. And with those community members, they tell stories. And so sometimes I will put 3 objects in the center of a cloth. Here you see a padlock, a key on a shoestring, and an HB pencil. What kind of stories would come to mind? Probably stories in high school. We tell those stories, we share them, and in the sharing of those, we enter what Husserl would call an intersubjective space, a space that's shared or commingled. This is a community group who are using pencils and a plank to symbolize paper, and they're telling each other stories, and the stories are being shared, and then they become fragmented, and then when the audience sees the performance, they trigger stories for them. Sometimes these stories are difficult stories. This is at a high school, and I have a fractured narrative with a fractured picture of a high school student talking about displacement and alienation. So in those stories, difficult information, I have to practice what I would call an ethic of care, of compassion. And so it's important for me to build that. Here I'm working with an elder newcomer. She's telling her story of displacement, and it's with a shadow screen, so that with her limited movement, we can make it much bigger, and together we can capture that story. So what I am doing with stories and objects and the body is I'm trying to cultivate communities and fortify communities, especially with marginalized groups. So thank you for having me here today.